My name is Matthew Heineman. I'm the director of Cartel. I've made a number of documentaries over the past 10 years. My first film was called Our Time, about what it's like to be young in today's America. I worked on a project with HBO on Alzheimer's disease. I then made a film called Escape Fire, about healthcare in the US. And now I'm here with Cartel. So for me, I really wanted to know and look at sort of what happens when government institutions fail. What happens when citizens live in a sort of lawless world. And in Cartel we have two groups, one in Michoacán in Mexico and one in Arizona. And they have leaders of these two groups, El Dr. in the case of Mexico and Nailer in the case of Arizona. And both of these men are 55-year-old men. They both believe that the government has failed. They both have taken the law into their own hands to fight for what they believe in. But the circumstances are quite different. In Mexico, the violence is real. The violence is visceral. 80,000 plus people killed since 2007. 20,000 plus people disappeared since 2007. Whereas in Arizona, that violence is much more theoretical. It's a fear that these Mexican drug wars will make its way into our country. So in some ways, the stories are similar, and in many ways they're quite different. For me, I really wanted to take the story about narco violence, the story about the drug wars, out of the headlines. I wanted to take it, there have been so many articles about it, TV shows, movies, but I really wanted to show what was happening on the ground, the suffering of everyday people affected by this violence, and the reaction of these everyday people rising up to fight back. But I went on this journey that I never could have imagined. I'm not a war reporter. I've never been in situations like this before, but the film took me into some very dangerous places. Shootouts between the vigilantes and the cartel, meth labs in the dark desert night, places of torture, places I never could have imagined being in. But I felt, a great duty and a great obligation to tell this story. I sort of fell in love with this country and the people of Mexico, and I felt a huge obligation to do this story right, to tell this story correctly. There's many, many scary moments in making this film. Moments where we were shot at, moments where we witnessed, people being tortured. Very, very difficult things to witness as a human being and as a filmmaker. But for me, the scariest moment was a moment that I spent with a young woman who was kidnapped by the cartel with her husband. And she witnessed her husband being chopped up to pieces in front of her and then burned to death. And to see this woman and to be with her in this room and see her sitting there, but to see her entire soul that was sucked out of her and to look into her eyes and see this deep hollowness and to hear her describe these horrors and to think that we are the same species of human beings that would do that to other people, that stuck with me much more so than any of the action moments, the bang bang moments. It stuck with me much more. No, I never thought about quitting the project. I think a lot of people wanted me to quit the project, but I think myself and my crew, I think we felt, a responsibility to tell this story, a responsibility to show the world what we were seeing. And, in some ways this film is very timely, and in some ways it's somewhat timeless. We've seen armed groups rise up throughout history, throughout literature. People, rising up to protect their towns or their families, to fight against evil. We see that throughout the world today, and we will continue to see that throughout our future. So for me, part of this film is a meditation and an examination of what motivates people to do that. And I constantly myself asked those questions, wondered what I would do. What would I do if violence came knocking at my front door? What would I do if my sister was raped by the cartel, or my brother was hanging from a bridge? Would I take up arms? Would I fight violence with violence? Is that just? Is that right? Is vigilantism a sustainable form of justice? These are questions that, especially early on, provoked me into making this film. I think, especially with this story, it's so easy to sort of put a label on things. These are the good guys. Those are the bad guys. This is right. This is wrong. And I think what I learned very quickly is that, so many people started, when I started telling this story, it seemed from the outside like, a sort of classic Western of guys in white shirts fighting against guys in black hats. But over time, I realized that the story is much more complex, much more gray, and the lines between good and evil were very, very blurry. And that's also what drove me to make this film, is to try to understand what was really happening with this movement, who these guys really were. It's very difficult, the situation that the doctor's in. We've maintained contact with his family and people close to him. They believe, there's been no due process, no trial. Many of his supporters and his family believe that he's in jail because the government is trying to silence him. It's a very complex situation, and we don't know what's going to happen. So Cartel premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in the United States, and it was a huge honor to be there, to show the film there, premiere the film there. And soon after that, Catherine Bigelow, who directed some of my favorite films, Zero Dark 30, Hurt Locker, someone I have enormous respect for and admiration for, she saw the film. She was very moved by it. We were connected, and through a number of meetings and conversations, we brought her on board as an executive producer to promote the film, to help raise the visibility of the film. And I think she, like I, really strongly believe that this film shows a world that most people have never seen before, and will hopefully create a very important dialogue around these issues in the film.
Okay.
I think in the process of making this film, I really fell in love with this country. I fell in love with Mexico. I fell in love with the people in Mexico. And I felt a great duty and an obligation to make sure that the film was shown here. And I'm very, very excited that the film is being released here in theaters. And I really can't wait to see the reaction that it provokes. I really hope it ignites a very important conversation. And I can't wait to see what happens. My name is Matthew Heineman. I'm the director of Cartel, which is being released here in Mexico on July 2nd. And I hope everyone comes out to see the film.